Hello and welcome to Upper Pen. My name is Dakota, and I am again talking with Travis Baldree today, this time about bookshops and bone dust. Thank you so much for being here, Travis.
Thank you so much for having me.
For anybody who hasn't heard, if they're living under a rock, I guess, what is Bookshops and Bonedust about?
Bookshops and Bonedust is a prequel to Legends and Lattes set about 20 years earlier, and it has to do with Viv the Orc's early life when she's just getting started on her adventuring career. And she's a little bit headstrong, maybe a little bit foolhardy. She, at the beginning of the book, is immediately wounded, and the mercenary crew that she's with, Rackham's Ravens, dumps her off in a crappy beach town to go and pursue their quarry on their own, and then they'll swing by and pick her up once they've wrapped things up. And she immediately runs afoul of the law, is bored to tears, and befriends the really foul-mouthed owner of the failing local bookshop. And the book is largely about the little seeds that we plant early in life that bloom much later. And it's about the power of stories and how we connect to each other through them. And it also has a lot of skeletons in it.
That it does. So it was like a perfect October fall vibe. So I loved it. Even though it's not out till November 7th, right?
Still safely in fall. So it works out.
Yes. Perfect. Speaking of Viv, so she's fantastic. She's great in Legends and Lattes, and then here you really get to see her like her early self shine, which I love. So
I'm glad. I'm glad. I feel like she's still the same character. You can tell it's her.
yes.
She just there's a bunch of things she hasn't decided yet. She has some very different goals.
Yeah, so in Legends and Lattes, she's very much done with adventuring. And then this one, she is like, why can't I still be adventuring? But then Fern, the foul-mouthed friend that she makes, is my favorite, absolutely my favorite in the book. I feel like you're
She's
gonna
my
get that a
favorite too.
lot.
She's my
Yeah.
favorite too.
So, how did you decide? Because it went from Viv and Tangerine, the first one. So
Mhm.
Viv is kind of brusque and Tangerine is very sweet, to Viv being brusque and then Fern being foul-mouthed and sweet. So how do you pair the two, I guess?
Um, well, I think that Viv's a little spikier in her younger self, and she needed somebody else that that's compatible with that spikiness, that has her own spikiness. Fern actually survived three other books that I tried to write, and she evolved through every version of those books, but she survived much wreckage to make her way into this book. She deserves to be there.
So what were these other books that you were doing? Were they just previous versions of Bookshops and Bonedust?
They were very different. So the when Tor picked up Legends and Lattes, they wanted a second book, and that was part of my agreement. And I told them what I was going to write at the time, and it was basically fantasy murder she wrote. It was going to be another character who is also in Bookshops and Bonedust, Zelia, who you end up meeting, was going to be the protagonist of that book. Burke was in it too. So was Pot Roast. So was Fern. And it was going to be it was a murder mystery. And it turns out I am not Agatha Christie. And making all of the murder mystery things happen for me ended up being at the expense of all the character stuff I wanted to do. And I am not a good enough writer yet to be able to balance that the way I needed to. So I was horrified. And then I tried to find what I was going to be able to write. And I tried several more times and I didn't quite get it. But I harvested a lot of organs from those dead books, and they were transplanted into this one.
That's a pretty nice way of putting that. Harvested organs.
They were
um,
willing donors.
well, is that how you came up with all of the stories within the stories in this book? So you have all these books that populate it, which
Mhm.
wonderful.
Those were all unique to the book. I didn't have those before, and the previous books didn't have that same thematic underpinning of sharing stories and understanding each other through sharing stories. So those were all fresh for the book. Um, and on I really want to say that I sat down for a long time and planned those out, but no, they just seemed like the right thing at the time when I got to them. Like, yeah, that's the story that should read right now.
They fit so perfect too. Oh my gosh. I was like, where are you getting these stories? Because they each have a little bit different tone too, and that's pretty difficult to pull off.
I mean, there was definite like approaches, there was, the romance is in the language of romance, and then there's a kind of very Sherlock Holmesy story that has that kind of language to it, and then there's sort of like the classic adventure tale that she gets started off with, which has that sort of um it's it's someone retelling the story of their life, and there's a very specific kind of language that people used to use for those stories if you go back and you read like Treasure Island or whatever. And that just seemed like the kind of story that Viv would start with. That would be the hook that's set.
It was very Moby Dick-esque in tone, that first one, and I
Hmm.
thought it worked so well for this. So, so she finds all these stories and she connects to Fern through that. Everybody's making fun of her because she's, this big burly orc, is she an orc?
Yeah,
Oh
yeah,
God.
she's an orc.
My mind was like, no, she's not. Why would you say that? But they're all like teasing her because she's reading, and they're like, oh, it must be a lot of like, picture books or something.
Yeah, Galena is her other foil. Yeah, everybody's a little spiky in this one. Everybody's got a little bit of an attitude.
The bartender's so sweet though.
I do like Brand. I like all my characters. I have this rule for myself is that if I put a character in, they have to be they have to be capable of being a main character. Like I could write a book about them. And if I couldn't write a book about them, they don't go in.
That's rough, but also wonderful for readers. Because then
And
you
it's
never
not,
have a flat character.
yeah, I just have to know enough about, I have to see them and say, like, I mean, you just have to know just enough about them to get the idea that yes, they have their own world. They have their own thing going on. And I think it doesn't take a lot to do that, usually, but when it's not there, I miss it, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so there's also Maylee, right?
Hmm.
She is the summer love, right?
She is
And
the older woman, the
yeah,
summer love, who already, in a lot of ways, followed the trajectory that Viv is going to follow later. She was already somebody who retired and said that she'd had enough. And they're just at very different points in their lives.
yeah. And it feels like she's like a model for Viv later. Like she's this wonderful woman who's made something of herself after leaving what they thought would be their life.
She is, and she has a different perspective on what a relationship is as a result of that. Their perspectives don't match. They're not at the right place in their lives at the same time. And, you know, I wanted her to be there because I wanted her to be, in a lot of ways, the book is about, in a meta way, about the fact that prequels still matter. It's a prequel, and a lot of people don't like prequels because they're like, well, I already know how everything turns out. Except, do you? Do you? It's not about whether people live or die. It's not about where they end up. All of the parts are meaningful of the story, not just the end of the story. Otherwise, why wouldn't you skip to the end? That's the only part that matters, you know? Um, so I wanted it to be, I wanted her to have a relationship that was foundational to what she would eventually need to have a successful relationship but without treating that relationship as something that's disposable or meaningless.
It's difficult to kind of capture that sometimes. So how do you make it feel not disposable, I guess?
My hope was that when you read the epilogue, that there's a connection between what she learned and what she felt, and that it closes a loop, and that you can see how one is required for the other to even happen.
Yeah.
That if she hadn't had that relationship, she would not have ended up where she ended up, and she would not have been the person that she was, who was cautious about relationships, who had learned that maybe they mattered more than she initially thought they did. that they required more care, they required more investment. And if she had not done that, she wouldn't have been the person she needed to be in Legends and Lattes for any of that to happen. That's my hope anyway. That's the way it feels like when you read them.
It felt very natural because you start off with the romantic story that Fern gives her, and it's what the
Heart's
heart,
Blade.
yeah, Heart's Blade. Um, and Viv is like, "Why am I reading this? Why? I'm not going to stop, but why?"
Yeah, I'm not
Um,
sure this is going to work out for me. Yeah.
that really sets the seed of like, relationships matter here. And it like dawns on her pretty early, and you get that with Fern and then with Maylee, which is beautiful.
I like the fact that Fern uses books to probe Viv to find out who she is. That they're everyone is like a little testing poke just to see what comes back, you know.
I want Fern in my life so she can recommend good books all the time. Just
Good booksellers are worth their weight in gold.
they are, and they're hard to find nowadays sometimes, so cherish them. So you talked a little bit about how the book evolved from what you were originally thinking because you didn't have the tools or the experience, I guess, to write the Murder She Wrote
Hmm.
novel. Do you plan on trying to go back to those original ideas later?
There's lots of pieces in them that I want to revisit. And I think I may have, as far as murder mystery goes, have discovered that I'm much more on like the Knives Out Scooby-Doo end of the spectrum, where I care more about the weirdos than I do about the mystery. Like, I don't remember any of the particulars of the mystery and Knives Out. And in Scooby-Doo, they just take a mask off at the end. I don't ever remember the mystery. All I cared about is the people involved in the mystery. Um, so I think that maybe I can write one from that perspective, where it's more about the ensemble than it is about, whether the clue was what is this? What's this? The deduction, I guess. And there were definitely characters and ideas in the other ones that I liked. And I think that the next book I write will have a main who is one of the characters that was in there. We'll see.
That's exciting to hear, but I love that you kept pot roast and you just
Pot roast
transformed
had to
it to
stay.
Fern.
Pot roast had to stay. Pot roast had to stay. The only things I was sad to leave was I don't know, we're getting into kind of spoiler territory here.
Oh,
I will just say that there were three skeletal rats, like little rats in one of the previous versions, who I liked a lot, and they're still lurking.
oh. Okay, well, we'll move away from this for now. So, did you do the audiobook then?
I did ages ago. It's
How's
weird how long ago I did it.
Okay, so it's really bizarre because I talked to you when you signed your tour deal, and it feels like
Hmm.
this book came out so fast. It was like a year and a half ago, maybe.
Yeah, and it's been written for a year. So I started writing it in, I feel like it was May or June. I probably started trying to write in May, and then I had a month of disaster. And I think I want to say in late June, I wrote it and it took about 6 weeks. And then I went through an edit with my independent editor, and then I believe I turned it into Tor sometime in late October, something like that. Um, it seems like just an eternity ago now. Yeah, I turned it in nearly about a year ago.
Yeah, it does simultaneously feel like forever ago, but also like 2 months ago, though. So,
Yeah,
but you finished recording the audiobook back then, right?
I did it. I think I did it this spring. I think I did it in like February or
Okay.
something when there was a final signed off copy that had been through Copy Edit, or mostly through Copy Edit. Yeah, that's feels forever ago too. So
Was it like, did it feel different having it just sit there for the last like
it is
eight
weird to
months?
have it sit there, especially since plenty of arcs have been sent out. You
Yeah.
know, it's not like people aren't reading it. And so it's very strange to have a fairly reasonable number of people read the book, but not everybody. It's kind of weird, especially given the release the release speed for the first book, which was like it, 2.5 months after I finished it. So it is very, very different.
It's got to be strange because you come from like the self-published lit RPG authors doing all these audiobooks, and like those are just released so quick, bam bam
So
bam.
quickly. They
Yeah.
finished writing them and then they turn them over to me the next day, you know. I
Yeah.
have it's a bonkers release cadence and it's just a very, very different.
Yes, it's just so strange to me, but it feels like this one in particular just went so fast in the publishing world, because sometimes it's like 2 years it just sits there, it feels like, you know.
I think they definitely really wanted to hit it on they wanted it on a year cadence. They wanted it not to have
Okay.
a bit too big of a gap between. So I had a pretty aggressive schedule to get it written, which seemed totally reasonable after writing the first one in a month. And it's still, I mean, I got it done. Um, but yeah, I think they wanna, kind of like a one a year sort of thing going on.
So does that mean you're working on book three now
Not yet.
then? Okay.
Book three is due next end of next summer. And I took a year to try and fix my life.
Everything seemed to explode for you.
We,
So
yeah, we were just talking about my Google Calendar. So this year has been trying to resolve my Google Calendar and not doing a particularly good job of it. And I have a lot of parts of the other book just kind of laying on the floor of the garage, so to speak.
yeah.
And I'm trying not to look at them too hard, but every time, I'll think about something and I'll toss it on the floor. And then next year I'll start putting that together into a thing.
So are you trying to reduce the number of audiobooks you're recording then, to like give yourself some
Yes,
space?
I'm trying to ratchet that down a bit because I have a very aggressive audiobook recording schedule.
Yeah,
It's
even before
not
you
a
wrote the book.
yeah, it's not a normal audiobook recording schedule. It's a little nuts. So I've been trying to gear that down. And ideally that will start to pay off next year. But a lot of the time I win back, I often end up spending on book stuff. Like I got book tour in November and, various different book events or cons or what have you. So I end up consuming a lot of the time I went back to do book stuff, which is great. I love doing those things, but I haven't achieved the perfect balance yet.
Don't you have small children still?
My children are pretty big at this point. My youngest is 13 and my oldest just
Okay.
started college. So I don't have to worry so much about, somebody dying if they fall down the stairs or turning on burners. So most of that kind of level of drama I'm past because I'm old now.
You're not old. But um I just think it's so interesting that like your life is so chaotic at this point. I don't know why I find it so fascinating, but
It's
I
just a
do.
hot mess. It's just a hot mess.
Sometimes I just watch your tweets and I'm like, oh, he's having a not good day. Uh,
It's been I trip over myself. I'm very bad at saying no. Um, Terrible at it, in fact. I'm learning, but I'm not any good at it at all.
yeah, you got to get an agent for them to say no for you.
And I have thought about getting a personal assistant, but the amount of work it feels like it would be to offload everything is just so daunting that I balk every time.
So you have like you've done this before though, because you had your like software company, right? Your like gaming company.
Hmm.
So you've done this to yourself before.
I absolutely have. It's a chronic thing for me. Um, and For a while, audiobooks were kind of like a limiting factor because if when I was just doing audiobooks, there is a limit to how much you can do a day because your voice gives out. So you can only record for so long. So you just can't totally work yourself into the ground until you add anything else to that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I love bookshops and bone dust. Let's go back, I guess.
instead of talking about my terrible scheduling.
Well, I don't want to be, make anybody sad because it's such a good book, and like I love all of the different features in this, and it's really just like Viv finding extra family all over the place, and I love it.
Um, I when I wrote it, I really didn't want to write the exact same book. I was like, oh no, I don't want to write about people starting small businesses. But I felt like I had to include a small business. So there effectively is, but it's not hers, and it's not really about it. Um, and it was actually kind of a challenge to try and figure out to make something, how to make something that felt like it was of a piece with the other book that people would recognize and still connect to, that didn't tell the same kind of story. Because that's one of the reasons that the second book was going to be a murder mystery. I was like, I immediately need to do something different. It needs to not be the same kind of book. And I want to use a lot of the feeling and the style of storytelling, but I just want to tell a different kind of story. Um, so, which is one of the reasons that I think I'll probably try and go back there, is because if I can find a way to do it right, I can, even more firmly establish that I can tell different kinds of stories here.
Well, so you have some similar elements, like you have the small business and you have Viv kind of on a journey of self-discovery, and then you have the very kind of mild romance
Hmm.
that is in it. But the framing device is so different, and the characters are very different. They're not the same. So it feels like a completely different story, if that makes sense.
I'm glad. I'm glad because I did not want it to feel like the same thing. I think everybody feels younger. I
Yeah.
think it's, but still not teenagers, which is a big thing for me. I don't want people to feel like teenagers when they're not teenagers, but and things like the romance don't go the same way.
Yeah.
Things don't end in the same way. Have a different trajectory. There is a trajectory, but it's pointing in a different direction.
Yeah. So I don't know, it doesn't feel like the same book. And that's a major accomplishment when you when you have these books in series. Sometimes it just is hard to avoid kind of repeating territory. And I think you did a very good job avoiding that. Because
Thank
Fern,
you.
she's inheriting a business that is failing, right? And Viv was had the problem of starting one completely.
Hmm.
So yeah. Um, what so in addition to like those elements, the framing devices being different, you also have more fighting in the beginning for sure.
Hmm.
Um, and then there's also like the skeletons that are in it.
Yes.
So it feels dramatically different there too. And that was like a fun, weird turn.
I wanted to have more of, in a lot of ways, the first book could have been almost anywhere.
Yeah.
It had a core fantastical element, which was the Scalford Stone, but that's kind of in the background most of the time. And I wanted to, especially since it's younger Viv, I wanted to say, well, it's a fantasy world. Fantasy world stuff happens. It's still not about those things, but they're absolutely there. Um, and I wanted them to be more apparent. Um, and while I didn't want to write an action adventure book because that's not the point of it, I still wanted some of that to creep in because I want you to have the understanding that this is a life that she understands and is still into. And you have to show some of that or you don't get that. Um, and perversely, I really like writing action scenes. I actually really enjoy it. I was delighted to write the fire scene in Legends and Lattes because that was my big action set piece. And I was like, I love writing these. This is great. So I enjoyed doing that again, and I got to do a couple in this one. Three, honestly. Actually, four.
Yeah.
Four, because when she encounters the man in the cloak,
Yeah.
there's a bit of a anyway. So I got to do like four action scenes, and they don't dominate the book at all, but I still got to put them in.
Yeah.
And yeah, skeletons. We got there's definitely some more fantastical stuff in this one that is core to the story and that can't be removed and couldn't show up in modern day America. It's different.
You say that, but something I love about these two books, Legends and Lattes and Bookshops and Bonedust, is they are a high fantasy setting, but they're real people. So there's orcs and there's ratkins and there's dwarves, but like they have real people problems.
Yeah.
And they're not different, right? I think a lot of times with some fantasy, like people try and reach too far to make the different fantasy races seem so different.
There's an element of like, I mean, there's different kinds of fantasy
Yeah.
storytelling. Some of fantasy storytelling is about taking you to another world and just kind of like, it's like fantasy tourism. Like it's so different. It's like going to a different place. You read Dune and you're just like, oh, everything is just so kind of exotic,
Yeah.
which is a certain kind of attraction. But by and large, I don't think people are any different anywhere. Once you get past how they speak and like local traditions, for the most part, people feel and worry about the same things. Um, and on this end of the spectrum, I think there's fantasy where it's like I want all of the latitude that fantasy gives me to do fantastical things to support what the story that I want to tell, but I want the people to be immediately accessible. I want you to recognize them because it's not fantasy tourism. I'm not taking you to like some weird world that you don't know and I can dump 100 pages of lore on you so you can hear all about the political system. I don't care. Um, I want to use fantasy to present situations that like heighten or support like everyday drama, basically. And also in some ways to just like reinforce this sort of wild sense of diversity that there's a million different kinds of people from all kinds of different backgrounds and in this case physiology and everything else, but they're still all recognizable as people.
I think you do it so well here. And it's because of those moments for me where like Viv and Fern is like quizzing her on why she likes these books that she's given her, right? But why do you like it? And it really just humanizes everybody to have them have these instant conversations. And you still have those moments of like, oh God, she's an orc because there's a dwarf looking at her funny, right? But
Yeah.
it's not pushing you out of the fact that this is like a character story. So yeah.
And I think there's a certain level of comfort to just people who are dramatically different just getting along and that not being an issue and
Yeah.
being the idea of like no matter what I look like or feel like or how I present myself, it doesn't matter. It's just okay. We all have these common human concerns, and that's all that matters.
Yeah. So segueing to kind of what cozy fantasy has become because of you. Do you realize how many books are out in cozy fantasy now?
It seems like a lot now. It's kind of definitely, and I, I kind of feel like Legends and Lattes was really just a lens that particularly focused people's vision on a specific kind of story that already existed. And I think there's been a lot of shuffling through the backlists for like, oh yeah, this was already doing that. Hey, guess what? This has been going on forever. But um, I think that uh, I think there's just a current appetite for that kind of storytelling because of, look around you. Um, and it just happened to be in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, it feels like it almost gave permission to for people to actually publish these stories that they were writing, or feel like they had a place because Legends and Lattes was wildly successful, right? Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so thank
And,
you.
and
I'm
and
so
I think
glad.
everybody was surprised, and so now it's just like, oh yeah, okay, that's okay to do. We can.
Yeah, I have like six more cozy fantasies on my desk that I will eventually read because they are, I want to read them so bad, but there's other things that I need to get done committed.
I think I mean, I've seen a lot of writers who were writing other kinds of stories and then were like, oh, yeah, I do. Actually, this just sounds like a really nice break just to do
Yeah.
this. And also people want it, sign me up. Um, so I think that's fabulous. I think people should write what they want to write.
So the new book is a little bit longer than Legends and Lattes, right?
Mhm.
So I was looking at the audiobook length because this is how I determine how long books are now. Not by page number, it would seem. But the first one was like 5, 6 hours, and then this one is 8 hours now.
I think the first one was about 6.5,
Yeah.
and then the short that got added to it got it up to like 7, and this one is 8.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know, I can't do math in my head. It was about 80, I think it was like 82,000 words, and the previous one was like 63,000 words, something like that. So it's a little bit longer, but it's still pretty brisk. 83,000 is not a long book.
Well, it's not a novella either, though. And I think the reason it feels so quick is because the pacing is pretty on point. So, like, you did really well moving stuff along, even though, like, Viv is laid up for a few days, you know?
It's
So,
funny to have a brisk book about, being bored in a beach town. And
one of my absolute favorite moments is when she first goes outside the inn that she's staying at and she looks around and she's like, oh, it's a beautiful beach. I hate it here. And I was like, oh, I feel you.
it's just that feeling of it just it's like going to a beach town in the off season. There's that feeling that you get when you look out and you're like,
Yeah.
oh no.
I live in an area like that. So I'm like, oh, I feel it. All the tourists are gone now. But are you working on anything in particular besides getting your life figured out?
There are projects going on that I can't say anything about yet. Um, and there's a lot of mostly just gearing up for book tour. So various events and Comic Cons and whatever, and then book tour in November. And then of course it's the holiday season. So that pretty much occupies all my time for now. And just, squirreling away all of these nuts for the winter to hopefully grind up and make a story out of next year.
Well, I'm excited to see what you come out with next. And I was thrilled that you were in the new Dungeon Crawler, Carl, even if it did, muck up your schedule.
No, actually, that one was 15 minutes. It was great. It took me 15 minutes and I got to be Raoul and it was a breeze. Um, and it was just such a delight to do and also so incredibly fast.
I think Jeff and Matt are very fun people. And so they
They
must create a
are.
fun environment.
They are. They are. I ran into both again at Dragon Con.
Yeah.
They're both really cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. And I honestly can't wait to get my hands on a physical copy. So, I'll be looking out on November 7th.
Me too.
Also, you have so many special editions of your books. What is
It's
happening?
it's really weird. I don't know. I don't know how those get decided on or done. I'm grateful that they happen. Um, and they're really cool to see, as are translations. It's just whenever I get a translated version, it's just super wild. Um, I I'm delighted. It feels like overkill, but
Every time I see one, I'm like, oh my gosh, they made it prettier somehow. How do you do that? Like, what are you doing?
just sustained effort.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much and have a lovely night, everybody.
Thank you so much.